NBA star falls for an obese lady. But when he regretted his decision, Trey Sanders wiped the sweat off his brow as the deafening roar of the crowd echoed through the arena. He had just nailed a buzzer beater, securing his team's place in the playoffs. The cameras flashed incessantly, capturing every second of his triumph. As his teammates hoisted him onto their shoulders, Trey grinned, soaking in the adoration. Yet, even in this moment of glory, there was a faint, nagging emptiness in his chest. The celebrations felt hollow. Trey couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the high of the game faded faster these days, leaving behind a sense of longing he didn't understand. Later that night, while his teammates partied in an upscale nightclub, Trey slipped away to wander the quiet streets of the city. He loved basketball, but the constant buzz of fame often left him craving something simpler, something real. His feet carried him aimlessly until he found himself standing in front of a small bookstore. The warm light spilling from the windows beckoned him inside. Ellie Hart was sitting behind the counter, nose buried in a novel. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up, her brown eyes meeting Trey's. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Trey's towering frame and confident swagger made an immediate impression, while Ellie's quiet warmth and understated beauty caught him off guard. "Welcome," Ellie said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, even though she couldn't ignore the striking figure in front of her. "Can I help you find something?" Trey scanned the shelves, realizing he hadn't stepped into a bookstore in years. I'm not sure," he admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "What would you recommend?" Ellie's lips curved into a small smile. "That depends. Are you looking for something light and fun, or something that'll make you think?" Trey hesitated, then said, "Something that'll make me think." Ellie stood and moved toward a shelf near the back. Trey followed, noticing the way she moved with an easy confidence. She pulled out a worn paperback and handed it to him. "This is one of my favorites," she said. "It's about someone finding themselves in the middle of chaos." Trey glanced at the cover, intrigued. "Thanks. I'll take it." Ellie rang him up, her curiosity growing. She could tell he was someone important. His expensive sneakers and understated luxury watch hinted at wealth, but there was a humility in his demeanor that surprised her. "Enjoy the book," Ellie said as he left, watching him disappear into the night. Over the next week, Trey found himself thinking about Ellie more often than he cared to admit. There was something about her that stayed with him, a calm, genuine presence that contrasted sharply with the chaotic world he inhabited. On an impulse, he returned to the bookstore a few days later. Ellie was behind the counter again, this time sketching in a notebook. She looked up when the bell jingled and blinked in surprise. "You're back." "Yeah," Trey said, a sheepish grin tugging at his lips. "I finished the book." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Already? Most people take weeks to get through that one." "I had some downtime," Trey said, though the truth was, he'd stayed up late reading, unable to put it down. Ellie chuckled. "Well, did you like it?" "It was great," Trey said honestly. "Made me think about some stuff I'd been avoiding." Ellie nodded, her smile softening. "That's what good books do." Their conversation stretched on longer than either of them expected. Trey found himself telling Ellie about his life, how basketball had always been his dream, but the pressure of fame was starting to weigh on him. Ellie listened intently, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that made him reflect even more. In turn, Ellie shared bits of her own story. She had always loved books and art, but her passion had taken a back seat to helping her family. Running the bookstore gave her a sense of purpose, even if it wasn't the life she'd once imagined for herself. By the time Trey left, the sun had set, and the streetlights cast a warm glow on the sidewalk. Ellie watched him go, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so seen. Trey's visits to the bookstore became a regular occurrence. Each time, he and Ellie grew closer, their conversations delving deeper into their hopes, fears, and dreams. Trey found solace in Ellie's grounded perspective, while Ellie began to see a side of Trey that the world didn't know, a man who craved authenticity and connection. But not everyone in Trey's life was as accepting of his newfound friendship. His teammates teased him mercilessly when they spotted a paparazzi photo of him leaving the bookstore. "Who's the girl?" one of them asked during practice, holding up his phone. "She doesn't look like your usual type." Trey shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "She's a friend." "Friend," another teammate said, smirking. "Come on, Sanders. Don't tell me you're settling down." Trey forced a laugh, but the words stung more than he expected. The judgment in their voices reminded him of the unspoken rules of his world. Rules that left little room for someone like Ellie. That night, Trey lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He cared about Ellie, but he couldn't ignore the pressure to maintain his image. For the first time, he wondered if he had the strength to choose what truly mattered. Over the next week, Trey tried to push the doubts from his mind. He continued visiting Ellie, finding comfort in her presence and their conversations. But the pressure from his teammates and the media lingered, a constant reminder of the expectations tied to his fame. One afternoon, as Trey sat in the bookstore, flipping through a collection of poetry Ellie had recommended, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a notification about an article. NBA star Trey Sanders spotted with mystery woman, fans weigh in. His stomach clenched as he opened the article. The paparazzi photos showed him leaving the bookstore, Ellie visible in the background. The accompanying comments were a mix of curiosity and mockery, with some praising Trey for being down to earth and others ridiculing Ellie for her weight. "Everything okay?" Ellie asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. Trey hesitated, then turned his phone face down. "Yeah, just work stuff." Ellie frowned but didn't press. She could tell something was bothering him, but she didn't want to intrude. As the afternoon wore on, Trey found himself growing increasingly distracted. The article had stirred up his insecurities, making him question whether his connection with Ellie could survive the scrutiny of his world. By the time he left the bookstore, he felt like he was carrying a weight he couldn't shake. That evening, Trey met up with his teammates for dinner. As they laughed and joked about their upcoming game, the conversation inevitably turned to the article. "So, what's the deal with the bookstore girl?" one of them asked, smirking. "Is she just a phase? Or are you actually serious about her?" Trey forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to him. "It's nothing serious," he said, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. "We're just hanging out." His teammates nodded, satisfied with his response. But Trey couldn't ignore the pang of guilt that followed. He hated himself for downplaying what Ellie meant to him, but he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between their worlds. Ellie, meanwhile, noticed Trey's growing distance. His visits became less frequent, and when he did come by, he seemed distracted, his usual warmth replaced by a guardedness she couldn't quite understand. She told herself not to take it personally. After all, he was a busy man with a demanding career, but the change hurt nonetheless. One evening, as Ellie was closing up the bookstore, Trey walked in. His expression was tense, his movements stiff. "Hey," Ellie said, surprised to see him. "I thought you'd forgotten about this place." Trey offered a faint smile but didn't respond. Instead, he walked over to the counter and leaned against it, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I need to talk to you," he said finally. Ellie's heart sank. She could tell from his tone that whatever he was about to say wasn't good. "I don't think whatever this is working," Trey said, his voice low. "It's just complicated." Ellie stared at him, her chest tightening. "Complicated?" she repeated, her voice steady despite the hurt bubbling beneath the surface. "What's so complicated about two people spending time together?" Trey hesitated, then said, "You know how it is. The media, my career. It's a lot to deal with." Ellie nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "I see. And I guess I don't fit into that picture. Do I?" "It's not like that," Trey said quickly. "You mean a lot to me, Ellie. But not enough," Ellie interrupted, her voice sharp. "It's okay, Trey. I get it. You don't have to sugarcoat it." Trey opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. Ellie's calm composure only made the guilt heavier, and he realized he had underestimated her strength. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie nodded, her gaze steady. "So am I?" After Trey left, Ellie allowed herself a few moments to grieve the loss of what could have been, but she quickly resolved not to let it define her. If Trey couldn't see her worth, that was his loss, not hers. She threw herself into her art, channeling her emotions into a series of paintings that captured the raw intensity of her feelings. At first, it was just for herself, but as she shared her work online, it began to gain attention. People connected with her honesty and vulnerability, and before long, she was invited to showcase her pieces at a local gallery. The opening night of the gallery show was a turning point for Ellie. As she stood among her paintings, surrounded by people who admired her work, she realized how far she had come. She no longer felt defined by her size or the judgments of others. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. Trey, meanwhile, couldn't stop thinking about Ellie. Her absence left a void he couldn't fill, no matter how many games he won or events he attended. He found himself scrolling through her social media, watching as she flourished without him. Each new post, her artwork, her advocacy, her radiant smile, was a reminder of everything he had lost. One evening, Trey came across a post about Ellie's gallery show. The image showed her standing in front of her paintings, a look of pride and joy on her face. Trey stared at the photo for a long time, his chest tightening with a mix of admiration and regret. He realized then that he had made a mistake. Ellie wasn't just someone he cared about. She was someone who made him want to be better, and he wasn't ready to let her go. The realization that he had lost Ellie weighed heavily on Trey. For days, he tried to focus on his games, his training, and his public appearances, but nothing felt right. The energy he once drew from the crowd now felt hollow, and the rhythm of his life seemed out of sync. Trey had everything he thought he wanted, yet the absence of Ellie left an undeniable void. One night, as he sat alone in his penthouse apartment, Trey scrolled through the photos from Ellie's gallery show again. The images stirred a mix of emotions: pride at seeing her thrive, guilt for how he had treated her, and a deep longing to be part of her world again. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what he felt. With a deep breath, Trey decided it was time to make things right. Ellie was surprised when she received a call from the gallery owner a few days later. They informed her that someone had purchased one of her largest and most personal pieces, the one she had painted shortly after her breakup with Trey. "Do you know who bought it?" Ellie asked, trying to mask the mix of curiosity and unease building inside her. "They asked to remain anonymous," the gallery owner said, "but they left a note. It's waiting for you at the gallery." Ellie picked up the note later that afternoon. It was written in bold, familiar handwriting. "I see your strength. I admire your courage. And I owe you an apology. T." She stared at the note for a long moment, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to brush it off, to keep moving forward without looking back. But another part, the part that still cared, wanted to know if Trey's words were sincere. Trey didn't stop at buying Ellie's painting. He began using his platform in ways that honored the lessons he had learned from her. During press conferences, he spoke openly about mental health and self-worth, challenging the unrealistic standards often imposed by the industry. He partnered with organizations that supported body positivity and inclusivity, lending his voice and resources to causes Ellie had always championed. Ellie noticed these changes from afar. At first, she was skeptical, wondering if it was all just another PR stunt. But as the weeks went by, she saw the consistency in Trey's actions and the authenticity in his words. Slowly, her skepticism began to fade. One evening, Ellie received an unexpected invitation. It was from Trey, asking her to attend a charity basketball event he was hosting. The event was focused on promoting diversity and inclusion, with proceeds going to community programs. Ellie hesitated, unsure if she was ready to see him again. But after much deliberation, she decided to go, not for Trey, but for herself. The event was held at a local community center, far from the glitz and glamour of Trey's usual venues. When Ellie arrived, she was struck by the warmth of the atmosphere. Families and children filled the space, laughing and playing as they mingled with the players. Trey spotted Ellie as soon as she walked in. She looked stunning, her confidence radiating as she navigated the room. He felt his heart race, a mix of nerves and excitement bubbling inside him. He approached her cautiously, his usual swagger replaced with humility. "Ellie," he said softly, "thank you for coming." Ellie turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't," Trey admitted. "But I'm glad you did. I've wanted to talk to you for a long time." Ellie crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "So talk." Trey took a deep breath, his voice sincere. "I messed up, Ellie. I let my fears and insecurities get in the way of something good. You didn't deserve that, and I'm sorry." Ellie studied him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. "You hurt me, Trey. You made me feel like I wasn't enough." "I know," Trey said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I've spent every day since trying to be better. Not just for you, but for myself. Because you showed me what it means to be strong, to stand tall even when the world tries to bring you down." Ellie's resolve wavered as she listened to his words. She could see the change in him, the genuine effort he had made to grow. But forgiveness wasn't something she could give lightly. "I appreciate what you're doing," she said finally, "and I can see that you've changed. But this isn't just about you, Trey. It's about whether or not I can trust you again." "I'll earn your trust," Trey said firmly. "Whatever it takes, for however long it takes. I just need you to give me the chance." Ellie's gaze softened, though she remained cautious. "We'll see." The weeks that followed were a test for both Trey and Ellie. He stayed true to his word, showing up not just with grand gestures but with small, consistent actions that proved his sincerity. He supported Ellie's art, encouraged her advocacy work, and respected her boundaries, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. Ellie, meanwhile, found herself slowly letting her guard down. Trey's commitment and vulnerability were impossible to ignore, and she began to see the man she had cared for in a new light, one who was finally willing to face his fears and fight for what truly mattered. One evening, as they sat together on the steps of the community center after another successful event, Ellie turned to Trey with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I never thought I'd say this, but I think I'm ready to give us another chance." Trey's heart swelled, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mean that?" Ellie nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But you'd better not mess it up this time." Trey laughed softly, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I won't. Promise." As they sat together under the stars, a sense of hope filled the air. Their journey had been messy and imperfect, but it had brought them to a place of understanding and growth. And for the first time, both Trey and Ellie felt ready to face the future together. In the days that followed, Trey and Ellie worked to rebuild their connection. It wasn't a smooth or easy process. Ellie's walls, built over years of disappointment and self-preservation, didn't come down overnight. Trey understood this and approached their renewed relationship with patience and humility. He didn't just make promises. He acted on them, showing her that he was serious about earning her trust. Their conversations grew deeper, filled with honesty and vulnerability. Trey opened up about his struggles with fame and the pressure to fit into a mold he no longer believed in. Ellie shared the pain of being overlooked, dismissed, and judged by people who couldn't see past her appearance. Together, they found solace in their shared experiences, learning that strength often came from facing life's challenges head-on. One afternoon, Trey invited Ellie to a private gym where he often trained. It was a quiet space, far removed from the flashing cameras and roaring crowds of his usual games. "Why are we here?" Ellie asked as she stepped onto the court, her voice tinged with curiosity. "I wanted to share something with you," Trey said, tossing her a basketball. "This is where I come when I need to clear my head." Ellie caught the ball, surprised by its weight. "I don't think I've held one of these since gym class in high school." Trey chuckled, his grin easy. "Then it's time for a refresher." For the next hour, Trey coached Ellie through the basics, his encouragement lighthearted but sincere. Ellie laughed as she fumbled through dribbling drills and missed shot after shot, her usual self-consciousness giving way to joy. Trey's energy was infectious, and for the first time in years, she felt comfortable in her own skin. As the session ended, Trey leaned against the hoop, watching Ellie catch her breath. "You're not bad," he teased. "With some practice, you might even give me a run for my money." Ellie rolled her eyes, though her smile lingered. "I think I'll leave the basketball to you." "That's fair," Trey said, his tone softening. "But thanks for humoring me. It means a lot." Ellie met his gaze, her heart tightening at the sincerity in his expression. "You're welcome. And thank you for sharing this with me." In that moment, the gym felt like a world of its own, free from judgment, expectations, and the weight of their pasts. It was just the two of them, finding strength in each other. Ellie's art career continued to flourish. Her gallery shows attracted larger crowds, and her work began receiving recognition beyond the local scene. She was invited to speak at events, where she shared her journey of self-acceptance and empowerment. Trey attended every one of her talks, sitting quietly in the audience and watching with pride as Ellie inspired others with her words. He admired her courage and marveled at the way she turned her pain into something beautiful and transformative. But as Ellie's star rose, Trey faced challenges of his own. His decision to embrace causes like body positivity and mental health drew criticism from some corners of the sports world. His teammates and coaches supported him, but the media often questioned his motives, portraying him as distracted or unserious. One evening, as Trey sat in Ellie's apartment, scrolling through a particularly harsh article, she noticed the tension in his jaw. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked gently, sitting beside him. "Regret what?" Trey asked, though he already knew the answer. "Choosing this path," Ellie said. "Standing up for what you believe in, even when it costs you." Trey set the phone down, turning to face her. "Not for a second," he said firmly. "If anything, I regret not doing it sooner. You showed me what it means to have real courage, Ellie. And I don't care what anyone else thinks. This is who I want to be." Ellie smiled, her chest swelling with a mix of pride and affection. "I'm glad," she said, "because the world needs more people like you." Trey reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I don't know where I'd be without you." "You'd be fine," Ellie said, her voice light but earnest. "You're stronger than you think." Trey shook his head, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "Maybe, but I'm better with you." Their lives weren't perfect. They still faced challenges, moments of doubt, misunderstandings, and the occasional sting of judgment from the outside world. But they faced these challenges together, leaning on the trust and respect they had worked so hard to rebuild. Ellie continued to thrive, using her platform to advocate for inclusivity and self-love. Trey found a renewed sense of purpose, not just as a basketball player but as someone who could use his influence to make a difference. As their bond deepened, they began to dream about the future. Not as individuals navigating separate worlds, but as partners building something extraordinary together. As Ellie and Trey continued to navigate their renewed connection, their individual growth became the foundation of their bond. Trey began to integrate his personal values into his public persona, a shift that resonated with his fans and teammates alike. Slowly but surely, he was becoming the person he had always wanted to be, authentic, driven, and unapologetically himself. One evening, Trey invited Ellie to a fundraiser he had organized to support local community programs. The event was held at a modest venue, filled with kids and families who had benefited from the programs. Ellie marveled at the warmth of the atmosphere, so different from the high-profile galas she had imagined Trey frequenting. "Pretty impressive, huh?" Trey said, appearing at her side with a plate of hors d'oeuvres. Ellie nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "It's incredible, Trey. You've created something really meaningful here." He smiled, his expression softening. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "I think you're giving me too much credit." "Not a chance," Trey said. "You showed me what matters, Ellie. He gestured to the bustling room around them. "This is because of you." Ellie felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, a young boy approached them, clutching a basketball in his hands. "Mr. Sanders," the boy said shyly, his eyes wide with awe. "Will you sign my ball?" "Of course," Trey said, crouching down to the boy's level. As he signed the ball, he asked, "What's your name, little man?" Jordan, the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Well, Jordan, Trey said, handing the ball back, I expect to see you on the court one day. Giving me a run for my money? Jordan's face lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically before running off to show his friends. Ellie watched the interaction, her heart swelling with admiration. You're really good at this, she said. Trey shrugged, though his smile betrayed his pride. It feels good to give back. I just hope it makes a difference. It already has, Ellie said softly. As the months passed, Trey and Ellie continued to build on their shared values. Trey's efforts to champion causes close to Ellie's heart only deepened her trust in him, while Ellie's success as an artist and advocate inspired Trey to push himself even further. One evening, Trey surprised Ellie with an impromptu visit to her art studio. He arrived carrying a bouquet of wildflowers and a small canvas tucked under his arm. What's this? Ellie asked, her curiosity piqued. I figured it was time I tried my hand at painting, Trey said. Grinning, Ellie laughed, shaking her head. I hope you don't expect me to be gentle. Nope, Trey said, setting the canvas on an easel. I'm ready for brutal honesty. They spent the evening painting side by side, their laughter echoing through the studio. Trey's attempt at a landscape was lopsided and overly colorful, but Ellie couldn't help but admire his effort. It's not terrible, she said, trying to suppress a smile. High praise coming from you, Trey replied, feigning offense. As they cleaned up, Trey turned to Ellie, his expression serious. Thank you for this, for everything. You've changed my life in ways I can't even explain. Ellie met his gaze, her own expression softening. You've changed mine too, Trey, and I'm proud of the man you've become. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was theirs, and that was enough. As Ellie's art career flourished, she found herself navigating a world she had only dreamed of. Her gallery exhibitions were gaining traction, her social media presence continued to grow, and her inbox was filled with invitations to speak at events about her journey and advocacy for self-love and inclusivity. Trey, despite his demanding basketball schedule, made it a point to be present for her milestones. Whether it was attending her gallery openings or watching her interviews from the road, he remained her biggest supporter. Their bond had deepened over time, rooted in mutual respect and an understanding of each other's struggles. But the challenges they faced weren't entirely behind them. One afternoon, Ellie was preparing for a major art exhibition when she received a call from one of the event organizers. They wanted her to revise her speech, suggesting she avoid controversial topics like body positivity and focus on her artwork instead. We think the focus should stay on your talent, the organizer said, their tone polite but firm. Not personal narratives that might alienate certain audiences. Ellie clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. My art is personal, she said firmly. My story is part of what makes it meaningful. The organizer hesitated before replying. We understand, but we want to ensure the exhibition appeals to everyone. Ellie ended the call feeling deflated but determined. She refused to compromise the message that had brought her this far. She knew she needed to stand her ground, but the weight of the pushback was hard to bear. That evening, she shared her frustration with Trey. They were sitting in her studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases and the scent of paint. They want me to water it down, Ellie said, her voice tight with anger. As if my story isn't good enough. Trey leaned forward, his expression serious. Your story is more than good enough, Ellie. It's powerful. And you've come too far to let anyone silence you. Ellie sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's just exhausting, Trey. Fighting to be seen, to be heard. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. It is, Trey said softly, because you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. You inspire people, Ellie. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Ellie looked at him, her eyes softening. How did I get so lucky to have you in my corner? Trey smiled, his voice warm. It's the other way around. The day of the exhibition arrived, and Ellie stood in the gallery, her speech clutched in her hands. The room was filled with attendees, all waiting to hear from her. As she stepped up to the podium, she felt a surge of nervous energy but steadied herself by glancing at Trey, who stood at the back of the room, his expression encouraging. Ellie took a deep breath and began to speak. When I started creating art, it wasn't just to make something beautiful. It was to tell a story about resilience, self-acceptance, and finding strength in the face of judgment. She spoke openly about her journey, weaving her personal experiences into the narrative of her work. The room fell silent as her words resonated with the audience, many of whom were visibly moved. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Ellie felt a wave of relief and pride wash over her. She had stayed true to herself, and it had paid off. After the event, Trey found her standing near one of her paintings, her expression contemplative. "You were incredible," he said, his voice full of admiration. Ellie turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "It felt good. Scary but good." Trey nodded. "That's because it mattered." Ellie glanced at the crowd still mingling in the gallery, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I think I'm finally starting to believe that." Trey reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You should, because the world is better with your voice in it." As the weeks turned into months, Ellie and Trey continued to navigate their individual paths while supporting each other through the highs and lows. They learned to balance their demanding lives, finding strength in their shared commitment to growth and authenticity. Ellie's confidence blossomed, her voice becoming a beacon for others who had faced similar struggles. Trey, inspired by her courage, continued to use his platform to challenge stereotypes and advocate for change within his industry. Though their journey was far from over, one thing was clear. They were stronger together, united by their shared belief in the power of resilience and love. As Ellie and Trey continued to grow individually and together, their lives became a delicate dance of balancing personal passions and shared goals. Ellie's advocacy for body positivity and inclusivity gained national recognition, with invitations pouring in for interviews and collaborations. Trey, meanwhile, used his influence to push for changes within the sports industry, advocating for mental health awareness and equitable representation. Their relationship wasn't without its challenges. The more public their lives became, the more they faced scrutiny, from strangers, the media, and even people in their inner circles. One afternoon, Ellie received a message from a prominent talk show host inviting her to discuss her journey. At first, she was thrilled, but as she read through the proposed questions, she realized many of them focused on her relationship with Trey rather than her art or advocacy. "They want me to be a sideshow," Ellie vented to Trey later that evening. "Like my story only matters because of you." Trey frowned, setting down the playbook he'd been reviewing. "That's not true, Ellie. Your story stands on its own." "Does it?" Ellie said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Because sometimes it feels like I'm just the girlfriend of the NBA star to these people." Trey crossed the room and sat beside her, his expression earnest. "You're so much more than that, Ellie. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve your time." Ellie looked at him, her frustration softening. "I know that in my heart, but it's hard to ignore the noise sometimes." "Then let's change the narrative," Trey said. "Let's make sure the world knows who you are, on your terms." Ellie smiled faintly, her resolve returning. "On my terms," she echoed. With Trey's encouragement, Ellie approached her next few public appearances with renewed confidence. She set clear boundaries, insisting that interviews and features focus on her work and message rather than her relationship. Though it was a struggle at first, her persistence paid off. Slowly but surely, the conversation shifted, and Ellie became known not just as Trey's partner, but as a powerful voice in her own right. Meanwhile, Trey faced his own battles. A series of heated debates within the league about player conduct and public image put him in the spotlight, with many questioning his choices to support causes that some deemed distracting. During a press conference, a reporter asked pointedly, "Trey, do you think your focus on advocacy is affecting your performance on the court?" Trey met the question head-on. "I think being a better person off the court makes me a stronger player on it," he said. "Basketball is part of who I am, but it's not all of me. If I can use my platform to make a difference, why wouldn't I?" The response garnered mixed reactions, but Trey didn't waver. He had Ellie's unwavering support and a growing sense of purpose that made the criticism easier to bear. As the weeks turned into months, Ellie and Trey began to explore ways to merge their passions. They co-hosted a charity event focused on promoting youth programs that encouraged creativity, athletics, and self-expression. The event was a resounding success, with kids and families flooding the community center to participate in workshops, games, and art exhibits. Ellie found herself leading an art session for a group of children, their laughter and enthusiasm filling the room. Trey stopped by during a break from a basketball clinic he was running, leaning against the doorframe as he watched her with a smile. "You're really good at this," he said when the session ended, his tone full of admiration. Ellie shrugged, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "It's easy when you're doing something you love." Trey stepped closer, his voice softening. "You make it look effortless." Ellie laughed, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "And you make playing basketball look like a walk in the park." "Guess we're both lucky." Trey reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I'm lucky because of you, Ellie." She looked at him, her heart swelling. "You're not so bad yourself, Sanders." Though life continued to throw challenges their way, Ellie and Trey found strength in each other. Their bond, forged through shared struggles and unwavering support, became a testament to the power of resilience and love. Every step they took together felt like a victory, not just for them, but for the lives they touched along the way. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, they faced it with hope, determination, and the knowledge that they were better together. The journey that brought Ellie and Trey together had been anything but easy, but as they stood at the precipice of a new chapter, they both knew it was worth every challenge they'd faced. They had transformed individually and as a couple, their bond forged in moments of vulnerability, courage, and love. One evening, Trey invited Ellie to join him at the community center where they had hosted their first charity event together. The building was quiet now, the halls empty except for the distant echo of their footsteps. Trey had arranged for a private dinner in the gymnasium, the space adorned with soft string lights and candles. Ellie laughed as she took in the scene. "This is unexpected," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Trey grinned, his usual confidence tinged with a hint of nervousness. "I wanted to do something special." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily, a reflection of how far they'd come. They talked about their dreams, their shared projects, and the people they hoped to inspire. But as the evening wore on, Trey's demeanor shifted, his gaze growing more serious. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Trey said, setting down his fork. "About everything we've been through." Ellie tilted her head, her expression curious. "Good things, I hope?" "Only the best," Trey said, his voice soft. "You've shown me what it means to truly live, Ellie. To fight for what matters, to love unapologetically, and to believe in myself even when it feels impossible." Ellie's eyes softened, her heart swelling at his words. "You've done the same for me, Trey. You've shown me that I deserve to take up space, to be seen, and to be loved for who I am." Trey stood and walked over to her, taking her hand in his. "I don't want to just be part of your life, Ellie. I want to build a life with you, together." Before Ellie could respond, Trey dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. Her breath hitched as he opened it to reveal a simple yet stunning ring. "Ellie Hart," Trey said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, Ellie was speechless, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his eyes and the weight of everything they had overcome. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, a radiant smile breaking across her face. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "1,000 times, yes." Trey slipped the ring onto her finger before standing and pulling her into his arms. They held each other tightly, the world around them fading as they savored the moment. Their engagement marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and excitement. Together, they continued to champion their causes, combining their platforms to create lasting change. They supported each other's dreams while building a shared vision for the future, their love serving as the foundation for everything they achieved. On their wedding day, surrounded by friends, family, and the community they had grown to cherish, Ellie and Trey promised to stand by each other through whatever life brought their way. It was a celebration of their journey, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and the courage to embrace who they were meant to be. As they danced beneath the stars that night, Ellie rested her head on Trey's shoulder, her heart full. She knew their story was far from over, but in that moment, she felt nothing but gratitude for the man who had chosen her and the life they were building together. "I love you," Trey whispered, his voice steady and sure. Ellie smiled, her fingers lacing with his. "I love you too." And with that, they began the next chapter of their extraordinary journey, ready to face the world together, hand in hand.